Thank you, Mark, and thanks everyone. And it's a pleasure to be part of this conversation. And I think the theme of the future of work and connecting it with the future of education is extremely important, timely, compelling. It's the conversation we must have, probably what we should have had a long time ago, and it's high time that we're having it. As Mark was saying, I had the privilege of being analyzing this issue from an academic perspective. I was a professor, an academic professor until 2 years ago, and then as a member of parliament and as a minister of education of Italy. Okay, let me start with this general reflection. I'll be speaking for about 25 minutes, so we have more time for Q&A. So if I were to give you a broader perspective, how I see this connection between the two themes and what the future may bring and how we can anticipate the future and harness the potential that may be coming out of that, I would start with a reflection on the past. And certainly the main framework of the past 2-3 centuries has been the one of separation. You can use this as a key word. I think separation is what really distinguishes the scientific breakthroughs of the modern era. If you think about Cartesianism, the whole, I don't want to sound philosophical, that's not my job, I just want to give you a broader framework. René Descartes started the modern process of scientific discovery by arguing that if you separate issues to the right level, you will always find a solution. So that it's not looking at the whole, but looking at the segments that distinguishes the scientist, the expert, from the the more generic approach. The Enlightenment was all about dividing different disciplines, dividing different sectors, dividing different subjects to make sure that you could analyze things with a certain simplicity. Those of you familiar with the concept of positivism, positivism was exactly the same, was arguing that you do not understand the whole, but if you can fragment it to the point of reducing it to bits and pieces, this reductionist approach can allow you to make sense of it. And so this is what has distinguished a very important phase of human evolution, which you may call it the pre-industrial and industrial society, in which reductionism was the key and separation were the key to make sense of things. Modern philosophy, modern industrial revolutions, they all led towards this convergence that segments are better than the whole, and this is what makes it possible to deal with knowledge. This led, of course, to an age of growing specialization. We're still seeing the final, the last effects of this approach. Perhaps you may call it today hyper-specialization, whereby you have experts of subsectors of subsectors of subsubjects. And of course, this gives you a great detail of confidence. When you know something, usually you know it very well. Usually you have experts that are extremely well-versed and knowledgeable about that topic. And this is often recognized as a sign of success. And rightly so, you may say. It's important to know everything about one detail. You these days have biologists that know everything about a special type of maybe unicellular being and are experts of that thing, but may not necessarily understand how that thing connects with the overall biology, but they can tell you everything about the behavior, the organic functions of that little subcellular entity. So, and I think specialization had a very important role to play, allowed a relatively primitive society to make inroads into scientific discovery, making sense of a number of things, and above all, it led to the technological revolution of the 19th and then 20th century. but it also generated a number of externalities. And at the beginning, these externalities, I mean, the term itself, externality, tells you that they were seen as irrelevant, they were taken out of any reflection. So you could know perfectly how to build a bridge. Now, the fact that this may have had impacts on natural ecosystems, on other dynamics, was of no concern for the engineer. The engineer's job was to build a bridge. He didn't need to care about anything else. So separation allowed us to become specialists. But as time went by, the specialization, the fact that we would only look at one segment of a more complex reality, started somehow coming back and turning on its back. And at the beginning, you could simply neglect the externalities. You could not care. But year after year, decade after decade, century after century, the number of externalities started piling up and adding up. And now we realize that some of these externalities are so significant that they risk undermining the sustainability of the entire architecture of our knowledge system. So paradoxically, we are the most knowledgeable society of human civilization, of human history, and yet we may be also the last one. We may be the last one because we neglected the evidence. Some cognitive psychologists use the term learned autism to describe how hyper-specialization has led us into the most profound details of segments of knowledge while ignoring the overall systems of knowledge. So we have created a society in which we know so well certain details, but blissfully ignore how those details connect to each other and explain greater systemic phenomena. And the externalities, and by externalities I mean environmental, social externalities, and so on and so forth, are incredibly powerful these days. We may talk for hours about environmental externalities. I mean, the other day I had to take a plane and fly over the first full-fledged European hurricane. So to my North American fellows, you're not alone anymore. In Europe, we have hurricanes. And of course, you may wonder, how's it possible that Europe, with all the systems we have, with all the knowledge we have, couldn't figure out years ago that hurricanes were going to come to Europe? But you may say the same about social trends. How do you explain that the most knowledgeable society, the most knowledgeable civilization, the most knowledgeable generation in human history is also the one that suffers from the highest levels of depression? It's also the one that has suicide as the main primary cause of death among teenagers. And it's also the one that's experiencing probably the highest levels of inequality in 2 centuries. So these are all externalities that we neglected. We never thought that creating a system of knowledge that also had an impact on a social and economic system would eventually generate so many side effects to risk undermining the system itself. And now what needs to happen is a shift. I mean, I think everyone agrees these days that we do require a shift. It's quite humbling and at the same time sobering to see our friends in Davos at the World Economic Forum having moved to the left of some of the environmental movements these days, you know, like, and talking about climate change and listening to science and the need to reduce inequalities as the primary causes of instability around the world. These are the champions of capitalism that these days have come to the point of recognizing that if capitalism continues this way, it will destroy itself, and that we cannot continue to ignore the systemic effects of our action. But paradoxically, the systemic effects of our action are to be ignored by a society that focuses on separation and hyper-specialization. If you go back to the Cartesian approach and Descartes and its revolution in terms of knowledge systems, that's exactly what he thought. separating man from nature was a way to understand nature. And separating nature in different components and then subcomponents and sub-subcomponents was the only way to understand it, leading towards a totally the opposite of systemic understanding of and interconnected effects. So now everyone talks about a shift, the need to have a shift, but it's hard to achieve any shift in society unless we achieve a shift in the way in which we learn about society, the way in which we educate ourselves about society. And this has got a lot to do with the kind of jobs and the kind of future professional perspectives we're going to be creating in the new economy. So if the approach of the past was the approach of separation, which, as I said, was extremely useful at the beginning, but it got to the point of creating so many externalities and side effects that now needs to be changed. The approach that we totally need now is the one of integration. We need to go from separation to integration. And the first thing that we need to do is a system of understanding reality that allows us to internalize externalities. So the concept of externality itself should disappear from our vocabulary. You know, old philosophers used to say that nature doesn't take leaps, right? So everything hangs together in natural systems. Well, you may say the same in knowledge systems. In knowledge systems, things cannot be separated. They're all interconnected. And so a concept like externality shouldn't even feature in our language, in our vocabulary. You cannot simply say, oh, you know what? I know everything about this. I don't care about how this affects the rest. This needs to become part of your curriculum. It needs to be part of your training. Think about even the way in which we talk about development these days. In the past, everyone spoke about development as if it was one dimension. You know, more developed society, less developed society. Development is good, underdevelopment is bad. These days, we have come up with a number of adjectives to describe development. Development is no longer enough. We say that development must be sustainable, but must also be inclusive, must probably be, I don't know, based on social cohesion, and so on and so forth. So it's like our vocabulary is regaining a bit of those nuances that come from the pre-modern era. Like trying to understand that there's no development if there's no environmental sustainability, but also if there's no social cohesion, and if there are no other dynamics. You cannot say that a society is developed unless it has all these different components together. And achieving sustainable development, achieving this new form of development is only possible if we really have integrated knowledge being taught in schools, being taught in universities, and becoming the cornerstone of a new model of job market and you may say market activity in general. You may know that as a Minister of Education, University and Research, I pioneered some of these things in Italy. I decided that climate change education needed to become mandatory in all schools, from grade 1 all the way to the end of high school. And this is not because I believe that climate change is a fundamental threat and everyone has to be prepared. Also because of that, of course. Of course, that's fundamental. But because climate change is a perfect example of what is wrong with our system of knowledge. Climate change is an integrated and systemic challenge. It's not a challenge that can be addressed by one single sector, by one single scientific knowledge, type of knowledge. It needs to be addressed through a multidimensional approach. You may argue, some people may argue superficially that climate change is an environmental problem, but it's not. It's not an environmental problem because it's mostly, if you will, a socioeconomic problem. When you understand that climate change is caused by how we produce energy, but also it's caused by how we move, how we produce food, how we exchange goods and services, then you realize that, wait a minute, it's not just cleaning up a park, it's not about cleaning up the water, but it's about tackling different dynamics at the same time. We cannot stop climate change unless we tackle all of them at once. And, you know, and often some people make the simplistic correlation between the climate change agreements, the climate change accords, and the IPCC work and UNFCCC work with what happened with the Montreal Agreement on CFC emissions. And that was more of an environmental problem because that was a gas that was generated by certain types of mostly house utensils, house appliances. And it was possible to tackle it by replacing those tools and creating a system that wouldn't generate those gases anymore. It was, in a sense, a thinking of separation worked in that case. Because you had one problem, you had one cause, you could simply replace the cause and solve the problem. Climate change is caused by so many different dynamics that have interrelated effects that it cannot be tackled by one single dimensional approach. And it's not by coincidence that we have known about climate change from 1965, and we haven't done arguably anything about it. Because we have understood from the very beginning that tackling climate change would have required something we were not prepared to take on, which is rethinking how we have designed our society. We affect climate change by producing food, we affect climate change by moving, we affect climate change by living, we affect climate change by communicating, we affect climate change basically with almost anything we do, from the moment we wake up till the moment we go to sleep. And so this requires a totally different integrated knowledge, and that's why I thought having it in schools will have a double effect. First effect would be to make it known to more people. But the second effect would be to stimulate a new way of teaching students about reality, about dynamics. Because of course, using climate change as an example, you would force new generation students to think, and their teachers to think more in terms of interconnections, in terms of how does our geography connect with our process of urbanization? How does our process of urbanization connect with our architecture models? How does architecture connect with social dynamics, and so on and so forth? You know, connecting things among themselves. This morning I was talking about mobility. And if you come from a specialization perspective, and if you come from a perspective of separation, the issue of mobility must be solved by transport experts, right? I mean, this is the most intuitive thing to do if you were renting a car, if you had a Cartesian approach. Give it to experts. The experts are those that have specialized in that field, and they will solve it. Yet, we know that the problem of mobility is far different or goes well beyond the issue of transportation. And we see more and more that we can positively affect the problems around mobility by rethinking work. So that probably, speaking as a lawmaker, probably if I were the prime minister of my country or the president of the United States of America, I would argue that I would rather ask the Minister of Labor to try and solve the issue of mobility than the Minister of Transport. Because the Minister of Transport will simply, or the transport experts will think in terms of means of transportation. They will say, well, we need to go from combustion engine vehicles to electric vehicles. And you're going to solve the problem, or part of it. And then many people will say, oh, but this is going to take 20 years because technology is not ready yet, and because a rollout program of full-on electric vehicles will require a massive reconversion of our car manufacturing companies, and so on and so forth. So you'll come up with a plan of 20, 30 years. But someone may say, well, why do people move in the first place? And if we, looking at it from a different perspective, you realize that, hey, wait a minute, people move because often they have to go to work. Well, but we know that by new technologies, we can do a lot of that work these days remotely, like you and I are doing now. And so we could immediately, as we wait for a new plan of transportation, which is necessary, but immediately we can start tackling that challenge or shaping that new dynamic by rethinking the way in which we move and why we move, and for what purpose. So the reason why we introduced climate change lessons in schools was to equip kids with better knowledge about climate change and how to prepare. Preparedness is fundamental, because simply telling them that the world is screwed up and it's going to probably be in trouble very soon doesn't help them. You need to tell them this is happening and this is what you can do. And this is how you can become a responsible and sustainable citizen. So equipping them with practical tools. And at the same time, it's about contaminating knowledge. It's about contaminating the entire, starting to contaminate, to positively contaminate the entire school curriculum by saying to geography teachers, history teachers, physics teachers, and so on and so forth, you cannot teach one module ignoring how your module interacts with the other modules. You need to have more interconnected approach, which equips the children with new knowledge tools. And the same we've done in universities. So one thing we have done at present is to introduce what we call Lecture Zero. Lecture Zero is one simple module about integrated knowledge and sustainable development that all university students have to take at the very beginning, all freshmen have to take, regardless of what is their field of study, whether they're studying anthropology, whether they're studying engineering, chemistry. They need to take the same class, which is about integrated knowledge. It's about understanding how things hang together. And again, built on a new school curriculum and then Lecture Zero, the plan is to have more and more students that will become well-versed in multidisciplinarity, which is the first level, interdisciplinarity, so understanding the connections between different disciplines, and finally transdisciplinarity, which is really the fundamental idea of going beyond disciplines and understanding how knowledge goes well beyond boundaries of all levels. And it's not just about mixing it up, it's about transcending it. The final goal is to have systems thinkers. And why do you need people that think in terms of systems? Because the future of our economic development and also future jobs will be more and more about connecting the dots. I call this a new humanism, in a sense. You know, that same humanism that was very typical in Italy in the 15th and 16th century, that perhaps was best represented by Leonardo da Vinci, someone able to connect knowledge and different types of knowledge together, which became the symbol of the past against the concept of hyper-specialization, can be reutilized, not to look back towards a romantic past, because it wasn't romantic at all. I think the separation and modern era had a very important impact, but we can use what we gain from the process of separation to build a new humanism, a new model of integration that doesn't neglect the need for specialization, but uses that specialization to connect it with other specializations, so that the engineer of the future will also be a bit an ecologist, someone that understands how engineering has to dialogue, has to talk, has to be connected with ecosystems. So that the doctor of the future will not just be someone that fixes a human creature, but also someone that understands how social dynamics are important to generate well-being and tries to take care of a human being rather than fixing a human body. So that, and this is fundamental, because technology in the future will require more and more of that. Technology will replace specialists and will require a new generation of general observers and facilitators, people that are able to connect. Technology will replace a number of hyper-specialized categories that now are still, present in the job market, and will require more and more connectors, people that can connect how to use a specific technology for different purposes. So, and for that kind of approach, you do need people that are able to think in a cross-cutting fashion, transversally. And that is not simply generated by practice. It needs to be generated also in the early stages of a person's education process. And it's fundamental that new generations are equipped with those tools. The technological revolution, artificial intelligence, new manufacturing technologies, and so on and so forth, will require more and more generic operators and thinkers that allow the technologies to be used for creative purposes. In Italy, we have a growing sector, which you find also in the US, in North America, and in parts of Europe, which is called digital humanities. So paradoxically, in the most specialized age of our civilization, in the most technological generation, we may find that a more humanistic culture, a more human science oriented culture may become extremely useful to everyone. So just like anyone should know a bit about technology and how that relates to knowledge, I think also technologists need to know more and more about cross-cutting social and human-based phenomena. Without these two sides coming together, we may not be able to harness the great potential that the technological revolution is giving us to deal with the existential challenges of climate change and growing inequalities. Thank you.